Kia ora, everyone. Ollie, I'll pass it to you to be able to start off with the housekeeping.
Kia ora, guys. As per usual, technical, not difficulties, but they're never straightforward with these events. Welcome for everyone who's just joined us. Just a little note, guys, that we do have a chat tab, questions tab, and a polls tab down on the right-hand side. We'll be using these polls throughout the event, so make sure you jump on and use them. And if you have any questions, add them into the questions tab. We'll be beginning shortly as it's already 11 a.m. I'm going to turn my camera off. And currently have 60 people in the call. Angela, up to you really when you want to get started based on how many people we have joining us today. It's great to see so many faces. Well, people.
Yeah, Ollie, let's begin.
Cool. I'm just going to jump off.
Kia ora, everyone, and welcome to Clearhead's webinar. My name is Angela, and I'm a medical doctor and CEO of Clearhead, an innovative well-being provider for workplaces. And today, I am very excited to be able to bring on the renowned Dr. Anna Lemke. She is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University and in the School of Medicine and a chief of addiction medicine. She's a clinician, scholar, and has been seeing patients as well as publishing more than 100 peer-reviewed papers and books that are even New York Times bestseller. Her new book, Dopamine Nation: Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, is an instant New York Times bestseller, and she will help us explore the role of dopamine and how do we moderate that. In addition, she appeared in the viral Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, showing an unvarnished look that social media has on our life. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, the reason I'm so excited about having you here and having the chance to speak with you is just in New Zealand, we have the highest youth suicide rates in the OECD countries. And I always get asked this around, what is wrong in New Zealand that we have these rates? And I have always struggled to answer this question around why young people today are struggling with their mental health. So super excited to be able to dive deep into this question with you today. To start off, maybe you could explain to us what is dopamine. That's a very clinical term. So you can tell us more about it, and then we can figure out how its role plays in mental health and poor mental health.
Sure, happy to start with that. So dopamine is a molecule that we make in our brains. It's a neurotransmitter. And neurotransmitters are the chemicals that bridge the gap between neurons. So the workhorse cell of the brain are these long spindly cells called neurons, but they don't touch end to end. There's a little space between them, and that space is called the synapse. And in order to allow one neuron to send an electrical signal to the next neuron, you need to have something called neurotransmitters, which are these molecular modulators that allow the neurons to communicate. And dopamine is one of those molecules. It gets released by the presynaptic dopaminergic neuron, binds to a receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, and then conducts the electrical signal. And dopamine is one of the most important neurotransmitters involved in the experience of pleasure, motivation, and reward. It may be even more important for motivation than actual pleasure. So, for example, there's a very famous experiment where a rat was engineered so that it didn't have dopamine in its key reward centers of the brain. And what the scientists discovered was if they put food into the rat's mouth, the rat would eat the food, seem to get pleasure from the food. But if they put the food even just a body length away, the rat would starve to death, which is to say that dopamine is really important, not just to pleasure, but also to the motivation that gets us willing to do the work to go and get the reward. Dopamine is also really fundamental to the progression to addiction. And what happens in the addicted brain has a lot to do not just with how much dopamine is released, but in fact, how the brain responds to increased dopamine.
Thanks for sharing that. So the thing that I really liked about your philosophy of this is that actually the body needs to be in balance at all times, even at a cellular level. And so this term is called homeostasis. And that's really where sort of your work has come in, which is saying that it's normal to use dopamine as a trigger to get the body doing the right things. But it's when there's too much on one side, you have the anti-dopamine gremlin, is what I've heard you say in the past. And that's kind of how you kind of get this imbalance. So talk us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so to me, one of the most interesting findings in neuroscience in the past 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. And by that, I mean the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So imagine that you had a beam on a central fulcrum, like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. And that beam represents how we process pleasure and pain. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way. And when we experience pain, it tips the opposite. One of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long to the side of pleasure or pain. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis, after any deviation from neutrality. So let's take an example. For example, in my case, as I talk about in my book, I did develop a compulsive attachment to romance novels. So when I read a romance novel, not anymore today because I've largely given it up, but that's a drug of choice for me that releases dopamine in a really special part of my brain called the reward pathway, and my pleasure-pain balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But again, no sooner has that happened than my brain will work to restore a level balance. And it does that by downregulating postsynaptic dopaminergic receptors and downregulating dopamine production, right? But it doesn't just downregulate it to baseline, it actually goes below baseline. This is called neuroadaptation. And I imagine this as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's that moment of wanting to read one more chapter, right? Not being able to put the book down, or when the book is over, wanting to reach for yet another book, to be able to stay in that place and avoid the kind of dopamine free fall or dopamine deficit state, which is the inevitable sequelae of the dopamine high, right? If I wait long enough, those gremlins hop off, that feeling passes, and homeostasis is restored. But the second rule of the balance is that if I continue to press on the pleasure side, I accumulate more and more gremlins on the pain side. And eventually I change my hedonic set point, or my joy set point, right? Such that now when I read a romance novel, I don't really get very much of, a high at all. So that initial response to pleasure with repeated exposures gets weaker and shorter, but that after response to pain gets stronger and longer. And eventually those gremlins fill this whole room and they're camped out there and they're not going anywhere soon. And now I'm in what we call a dopamine deficit state. And a dopamine deficit state is very similar to a clinical depression, right? I'm anxious, I'm irritable, I'm restless, I can't sleep, and I have craving. I have intrusive thoughts of wanting to use. Now when I use, I don't get high, I just feel normal. And when I'm not using, I'm walking around experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal, which are psychological, which are, again, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use.
Yeah, I mean, really what you're describing here is things that we see clinically and when people present with addiction. And you've done a very light-hearted example with your romance novels, but a lot of us have social media rule our lives, and it's really hard either as individuals wanting to use less social media, but also maybe as parents seeing their child struggling and feeling that they have more poor mental health than they did in their generation, and wondering whether that's all the fault of social media. Would you like to share a little bit more on the insights on the role of social media and technology and mobile devices? Because you can really bring in that example from your clinical practice of patients that you see with these challenges, and what did you do to kind of help them get past that?
Yeah, well, the first thing I think that's really important in this discussion is to recognize that social media is a drug. And it's, most people who use a drug are not going to get addicted to that drug. Most people who use alcohol will not go on to be addicted to alcohol. But there will be a subset of individuals who will be vulnerable to addiction to the drug that is social media. And this gets into this whole concept of drug of choice, right? What tips your balance to the side of pleasure may not tip mine, and vice versa. So we all have our different predilections. But for those who are vulnerable to the drug that is social media, being on social media has the potential to be addictive. We do know that making human connections releases dopamine in the reward pathway. My colleague here at Stanford, Rob Malenka, has found that it's actually mediated in part by oxytocin, which is our love hormone, which binds to dopamine-releasing hormones in the reward pathway. We know from an evolutionary perspective that we are incentivized through dopamine in part to make human connections, because being part of a group protects us from predators, allows us to steward scarce resources, allows us to find a mate. So we're clearly incentivized through dopamine release to make human connections, and it's good for us to do that. But what's happened with social media is it's essentially drugified human connection. The device itself is highly reinforcing, because we know that screens are like sort of modern day fireplaces. They're very attractive to us, innately rewarding. And then, of course, social media has taken human connection and made it all the more potent and all the more appealing, more accessible, and also more abundant. Like, if you think about the effort that it takes to meet people in real life, you have to go out of your house. You have to strike up a conversation. there has to be some give and take, right? And if it's not going well, you have to kind of try to make it go better, or maybe, slink back to your house and try to find somebody else, but that's all delayed. On social media, we don't have to do that. If we don't like the conversation, we can just swipe right or swipe left, find something better. The way that the likes and the rankings have enumerated the experience, dopamine is very sensitive to numbers or enumeration or ranking, so that makes it more potent as we hierarchically compare ourselves to other people. So it really has the ability to be this very powerful and very potent drug. And what happens is when we get caught in that, we get to a point where we essentially get into this dopamine deficit state. And now we need to keep using social media, not because it feels good, but because we want to prevent ourselves from feeling bad, right? We want to get back to homeostasis. The other thing that's really insidious about social media is that, it's natural and normal for people to kind of compare themselves to people around them as a sort of way to figure out, well, this is what I'm good at, this is what I'm not so good at, so that we can organize ourselves in groups. But what's happened with social media is that now we're not just comparing ourselves to our siblings or neighbors or people down the street. We're comparing ourselves to the whole world. And so inevitably, it gives us this feeling of less than, of being less than, of never being able to measure up. So the experience on social media inevitably leaves people feeling like they just can't ever achieve enough or be enough. Not to mention the fact that, a lot of the social media personas are curated personas, right? They're not the real life persona.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say that what you see is other people's highlight, and you see your own struggles, and we don't always realize that they are not apple to apple comparisons. It's really interesting. The audience listening into our call, majority of them actually spend less than 5 hours on social media, but maybe they might be wondering and dealing with people who spend more time than that. Uh, so that really gives us a good sense of sort of the environment in which we are all operating, and whether you're a young person or not. So can you share with us maybe what are the things that you're recommending, even in your clinical practice or in your book, around what people can do to manage this dopamine overload?
Yeah, so the first thing that I recommend is actually a dopamine fast or a period away from the drug of choice. And the reason that that's necessary is because it allows enough time for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off of the pain side of the balance so that homeostasis can be restored. Why is it important to restore homeostasis? Because restoring homeostasis gets us out of this constant cycle of craving and allows us again to enjoy more modest rewards, things that have lost their salience as our reward pathways have been hijacked by our drug of choice. But homeostasis also allows us to enlist our frontal lobes, that big gray matter area right behind our foreheads that's involved in future planning, delayed gratification, and storytelling, to be able to look back and see true cause and effect. Because many times when we're chasing dopamine, we can't really see the impact that it has on our lives. But when we get some distance, we can look back and say, oh, wow, I guess I was more caught up in that behavior than I really realized, right? There's this kind of idea that the world is sensory rich and causal poor. We're aware in the short term how something makes us feel good, but it's very difficult to see through an iterative process of repetition how that thing can make us feel bad. But when we get some distance from that thing, we're really able to look back and say, oh, wow, that's actually has all kinds of, bad things as a result. And now I want to change that behavior. So in my clinic, I recommend, whether, the drug of choice is video games or pornography or social media or email or texting or whatever it is, I recommend that folks put it away. Delete that app. Sometimes people have to actually put their phone away for a period of time. If it's a video game, they have to get rid of their various consoles that allow them, to twitch on video game, and to really go through that period of withdrawal. Because if you imagine, again, when you take away, the pleasure side, if you've accumulated all these gremlins on the pain side, you're going to initially go into withdrawal, and it's really hard. So I don't sugarcoat it. I let folks know this is really hard. And for your listeners out there who maybe don't have a personal experience with addiction or don't have someone they know with addiction, I would really urge them to just even put their smartphone away for 24 hours and observe the anxiety, the irritability, the intrusive thoughts of like missing out on something, fear of missing out, all of those rationalizations that our brain sort of inserts in our, to get us to reach for it again, because I think that can be very instructive. But essentially, I tell folks, to abstain for 30 days. Now, why 30 days? In my clinical experience, 30 days is usually the average amount of time it takes for the gremlins to hop off and for homeostasis to be restored. For some people, it may be less. For some people, it may be more. But on average, it's about 30 days. This is supported by some of the neuroimaging literature, like Nora Volkoff has looked at after 14 days and seen that folks are still in that dopamine deficit state, that the transmission of dopamine in the reward pathway is still not back up to normal levels at 2 weeks. And in fact, I see at 2 weeks, which is where people sort of turn the corner and start to feel better. So when I've had patients who have stopped for a week or two and said, well, I didn't feel any better, I usually respond by saying, I'm not really surprised because it wasn't long enough. Sometimes my patients will say, well, why can't I just reduce the amount? And I say, well, that doesn't usually work because you never restore homeostasis, right? You get to less, but you're still in that dopamine deficit state. So you're not able to enjoy other things or get that kind of mental clarity that's so important for really understanding true cause and effect. So that's the basic intervention. I don't pretend like it's easy. It's not for everybody. If you've got somebody who's seriously addicted to something like alcohol or benzos and could go into life-threatening withdrawal, that would be not something I would recommend. But for a lot of patients coming in, especially patients coming in seeking help for depression, anxiety, insomnia, distractibility, this intervention of just a dopamine fast can be enough to reset reward pathways and essentially make them feel better without my having to do anything else, without my having to prescribe an antidepressant, without my having to, engage in psychotherapy. Just by restoring healthy baseline dopamine, people feel better. So when we get back to your original question, why is it that the rates of suicide in New Zealand are so high when New Zealand is this incredibly, prosperous and privileged country in many ways, certainly relative to the rest of the world? In my book, Dopamine Nation, if there's a big idea in the book, that the idea is that, what is this paradoxical increase in anxiety, depression, and suicide, really the world over, that very clearly maps to wealth of nations. The richer the country, the higher the rates of suicide, depression, and anxiety. And that's been increasing over the past 30 to 50 years, and the less happy that people are. So the Global Happiness Survey done in many countries all over the world, the unhappiest people in the world are probably living in the United States, which is, one of the richest nations in the world. So, a hypothesis that I put out there as a possible explanation is that the reason that we're all more unhappy is because of dopamine overload. We're constantly bombarding our reward pathways in ways large and small that we're not even necessarily aware of with these feel-good drugs and behavior. And our brains were not wired for this, right? Our brains evolved over millions of years of evolution to approach pleasure and avoid pain, to do that reflexively in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, which is not the world that we live in now, right? This is a world in which we have really everything, handed to us on a silver platter. And I would also posit that some of the most vulnerable people in the world are poor people living in rich nations. Why is that? Because they have increased access to all kinds of unhealthy reinforcing drugs and behaviors without having access to the kind of healthy dopamine that we know, is ultimately going to be restorative for us. So it's this idea that by bombarding our reward pathways with too much dopamine, we've essentially all gone into a dopamine deficit state. Now we need to keep using just to feel normal. And when we're not able to immediately imbibe these reinforcing drugs and behaviors, we're depressed and we're anxious.
Yeah, we live in such a paradoxical world, don't we? Where we have more people dying from obesity than famine, and that's the same as well with the psychological concepts that you've shared. I'm going to sort of play a bit of a devil's advocate in the sense that saying, okay, Anna, I'm totally motivated. And, as they say, come New Year's time, lots of people sign up to the gym, but then most people don't go beyond January. What are the most common challenges that you see in your practice around that you have had to help people go through? So you mentioned one, which is people not seeing the effect and wanting to give up too early. So you've really signaled that it takes at least a month for these effects to come through. And you're right, a lot of habit forming research also demonstrates that you require really somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks before a new habit sets in. Mm-hmm. But what about those who are going through withdrawal? How do they manage that? What are the things they can do when they're going through that withdrawal phase that isn't, I'm just going to recapitulate into the device or the drug of choice?
Yeah, great. So a lot of things. First of all, there's something I called self-binding, and self-binding is ways of creating literal and metacognitive barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice, so that we can press the pause button between wanting to consume and actually consuming. And by slowing it down and having an opportunity to surf the urge of wanting to use, it makes it much more possible for us to enlist our willpower and not use. And I describe 3 broad categories of self-binding: chronological self-binding, geographical self-binding, and categorical self-binding. So geographical self-binding is actually literal barriers. And just to give the example of a patient of mine who was addicted to video games, what he did was he literally took his game console and put it in his garage, up on the top shelf. so that he could not access it. So that's one example. In my case, where I got addicted to romance novels, the sort of conduit was my e-reader, or the Kindle. And so I actually had to throw that away, literally get rid of it. So that if I wanted a book, I had to go to the library, right? So that's kind of that step in between. Another example is chronological self-binding. This is where we use time as a construct. And the 30-day dopamine fast is actually a good example of chronological self-binding. We say, well, I'm not going to use until this date, or I'm not going to use, until I've finished my dissertation, or, I've accomplished something that I wanted to accomplish. Which raises another key point that, after the dopamine fast, most people want to go back to using their drug of choice, but they want to use differently. They want to use in more moderation. So a lot of these self-binding strategies can be helpful for the initial dopamine fast, and others of them are more for when you re-enter use, how to create those barriers. The third one is categorical. So this is where, within a larger subgroup, we allow ourselves to indulge in certain pleasures, but not others. My patient who was addicted to video games, he knew that he could not play League of Legends. If he played League of Legends, he was just off and running. And he also discovered that if he pledged to just play with friends and not with strangers, he was more likely to be able to moderate. Because after his month of abstinence, when he did feel much better, he did ultimately go back to using, but he put all these barriers in place, right? He said, I'm only going to play on Friday and Saturday. I'm only going to play with friends. I'm never going to play with strangers. I'm not going to play with League of Legends. I'm only going to play 2 or 3 hours a day. I'm not going to play during the week. So these are all the kinds of self-binding strategies. Another really, I have more if you want me to keep.
So like growing up as a woman, I would often see my friends go on diets, and they'd go for the water fast, or the lemon juice fast, or something, some ridiculous diet, and then they'll lose all this weight, and then once they stop the diet, they'll gain it all back and more. I guess one of the questions is, what happened? So let's just say I was able to do that 30-day fast. I didn't cave. How do I prevent myself from yo-yoing back? What do you see works?
Yeah. So I just want to acknowledge that that's a real thing, and it's called the abstinence violation syndrome. I see it in my clinical practice. I experienced it. So I did a 30-day fast from romance novels. I thought, okay, I feel so much better now. I'm going to go back to reading romance novels, and I binged all weekend long and realized, okay, I actually can't moderate this behavior. So sometimes that's a signal that we are not in the category of people that are going to be able to moderate that particular drug, and we have to actually choose abstinence. Now, when it comes to something like food or digital devices, much harder, right? Because we can't just not eat, and we can't just not use digital devices. They're embedded into our daily lives. So that's again where these self-binding strategies become very important, where we have to make these categories. For example, someone with a sugar addiction, they have to make sure that they don't eat sugar, but of course they can eat, broccoli, and they can eat, steak, or they can eat other things, but they have to stay away from that particular drug if they find they're not able to moderate it. The other things that I would say is it's not just these barriers, but there are active things that we can do too to help, whether the goal is moderation or abstinence after the dopamine fast. And one of them is actually to intentionally press on the pain side of the balance, because those gremlins are agnostic to whatever the initial stimulus is. So if we press on pleasure, they're going to hop on pain, and we're going to have the come down, or the dopamine deficit state. But if we press on the pain side, they're actually going to hop on the pleasure side of the balance and reset our reward pathway to the side of pleasure. And that's a great way to get dopamine indirectly. And it's called the science of hormesis. Hormesis is Greek for to set in motion. And essentially what happens is that when we intentionally do things that are physically, emotionally, or psychologically challenging, we tell our bodies, I need to upregulate feel-good hormones like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, endogenous opioids, endogenous cannabinoids, as a kind of protective measure, right? And so it's very good to do that in that 30-day dopamine fast, but certainly thereafter. And this is typically what people will describe as the runner's high, or I often recommend ice cold water baths, where you're intentionally inviting pain into your life in mild to moderate doses. So you're paying for your dopamine up front, right? Because if you do that, those gremlins will hop on the pleasure side of the balance and you will get a sustained period of dopamine or feeling better. And if you think about this from a graphic point of view, when we ingest an intoxicant, we get a spike of dopamine followed by plummeting levels. This is dopamine free fall, not just to baseline, but actually below baseline. We're in that dopamine deficit state before it goes back up to baseline. So we have to pay a price for every pleasure. But if we invite pain into our lives, what you see for exercise or ice cold water baths, lots of experiments to show this, is that you get a steady increase in dopamine levels during the activity, and then those levels remain elevated for hours afterwards before coming back down to baseline. So we don't have that dopamine free fall that you get with intoxicant.
Yeah, I love that. I think that most people think that what a good life is that it's free of adversity, and actually that's completely not true. What we hear of, for example, is like, people talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but actually not many people talk about post-traumatic growth, and that actually if you face an adversity and you improve your mindset, you improve your coping behaviors, you develop that resilience, you actually have a better mental health state than you had before the adversity entered into your life. And so we often hear about sort of helicopter parents and bubble wrapping parents and sort of wanting to remove any sort of obstacles for their child. You're not teaching that child ability to overcome these adversity and then get the rewards from doing so. So I think that's super important. We do kind of live in a world where we are connected to others. We don't have to struggle alone. So what is the role of support networks in this dopamine fast that you talk about?
Yeah, so that was the third thing that I was going to say in terms of what people can do proactively, which is to connect with other people who are having some of the same struggles, even plan a quit date and a dopamine fast together with a friend or as a family. This is something that I really recommend families do together. So, they're openly talking about how it's a struggle for not just kids, but also parents. We're also struggling with these devices. And to importantly set up a social structure where people can make mistakes and where it's okay to be honest about making those mistakes. And then we lay out a path for making amends. And I really hold 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous as wonderful models for what I call pro-social shame, which is a container in which people are supporting each other in these difficult types of restraining behaviors. They're getting dopamine from the intimacy of that group. The intimacy is fostered by what I call radical honesty, where we're totally honest about the ways in which we're fallible and broken and need each other and need help. And then we support each other through that process of growth with a really strong value of telling the truth when we stumble and coming back into it. And again, creating that pathway for improvement, as opposed to this idea of destructive or malignant shame, where people feel like they have to be perfect. And if they mess up in their pursuit of, whatever it is, that they're going to be shunned from the group. So I think that's a really important piece of it.
Yeah, I like to call them accountability buddies, actually.
Yeah.
And so this really applies both for when you're trying to get rid of a negative habit as well as when you're trying to introduce a new habit. So for the longest time, I always said I wanted to try meditation as a way just to kind of keep a level of calm as I sort of juggle all these things in my life. And it's been helpful to sort of start the meditation practice with a friend and do it every day going into work and while I was sitting on the train. And every time I finished my 20-minute session, I would text my friend and said, "I've done mine, have you?" And that was a good way to kind of hold each other accountable. And if you do it long enough until it becomes a habit, then you don't really need to almost use that social accountability. But yes, peer pressure can be used for good as well. we've had a really great chat. So maybe just to sort of finish off, can you share with us what healthy dopamine looks like? Yeah, I think you hinted at it, but maybe give us some examples of ones that you see really works.
Well, I mean, I think, it's very experiential, right? And I think the key is to, and this is also true talking with our kids, getting our kids to think about not just how they feel in the moment, but how they feel after a particular activity or ingesting a particular substance, and really kind of develop that mindfulness and that awareness of, yes, it's wonderful to be in that immersive state of flow where you can forget yourself. And that's really what intoxicants provide to us, and that's a large part of their appeal. But then what is the price that we pay, that kind of falling away or dopamine free fall when we have to detach ourselves, and then being aware of how repetitive use gets us in that dopamine deficit state such that nothing else is interesting. And now we want to be in that sort of, let's say state of that trance-like state all the time. And that's the part to worry about. I think that healthy dopamine is anything where we pay for our dopamine up front. So where we have to effortlessly engage in an activity in a repeated way over time and invest in it, invest our creativity, our energy, our effort, and even endure some degree of physical pain. Whenever I talk about physical pain, it sounds so sadistic, but we are largely disembodied creatures, right? We're sort of these floating heads. We're very detached from our bodies. And so we need to really reconnect with our bodies and even reconnect with the experience of physical exertion, that is to say, some degree of pain. Now, you can take that too far. I have patients who get addicted to exercise, right? I have patients who cut on themselves. Why do they do that? Because in the short term, it really works. It releases a huge amount of endogenous opioids, and they feel better, right? And it's all about getting out of their own thoughts and getting out of their own heads. But the problem is tolerance develops very quickly to that, because if you press too hard and too fast on the pain side of the balance, it basically turns into a drug. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about mild to moderate and sustained kinds of effortful activities, both physical and psychological, that ultimately exercise the brain, stimulate production of dopamine, and get ourselves back to a resilient baseline dopamine level of firing, because we're all firing dopamine at a baseline level, but we change that baseline level depending upon what we do and what we ingest.
Thank you so much for bringing up that example around self-harm and people cutting themselves, because it's really, I really see it quite a bit where parents kind of, especially ones with daughters, really struggling to kind of know anyone who have not been cutting. And you've really explained the science behind it, which is that, the same way that you can get pleasure and then get addicted to that pleasure, you can also create dopamine using pain, and like you said, it releases that initial feel good chemical, but then it's not a healthy way of coping, especially if you're struggling with your mental health. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us from your research or your clinical practice before we close it off?
Happy to answer any questions. I can't see the questions, but if there are questions, I'm always eager to answer people's questions if I wasn't clear or somebody has.
Yeah, I've been weaving the questions in so that it's seamless for you. But it doesn't look like we have any further questions, and we have been talking for 40 minutes, which is a good amount of time for attention span, I'm sure. So thank you so much, Anna. And remember, it's impossible to cover all of Anna's work in this 40-minute webinar. So please check out her new book, Dopamine Nation: Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. It's an instant New York Times bestseller, and you can easily see why she touches on things that are close to home for a lot of us and really gives us very practical, if not very sexy, answers on how to deal with it. So thank you all again for joining us, and what a pleasure. Anna, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.